Hi everybody, Tim Hughes here. I'm the CEO and co-founder of DL Ignite. With me today I've got Karen Eber. Karen and I are going to talk about storytelling. But before we get into that, where can people get hold of you, Karen?
My website is the easiest place. So it is KarenEber.com. It links you to everything I have and gives you connections to some stories.
Fantastic. You had a massive thing happen in your life the other day, didn't you? Which is you did a TEDx talk about storytelling. Tell us about it. What happened?
A year ago, I did a TEDx at Purdue University where I had actually been guest speaking, and their TEDx team was in the audience and saw me and invited me to speak in the TEDx. And it was on storytelling and data and why you don't prioritize data over stories, that stories can really help people reach new understanding. And then about a month ago, I got an email from TED.com that they were promoting that talk to their platform. So in less than a month, it's almost at 1 million views, and it's been mind-blowing and overwhelming to see the wonderful reaction.
So we spoke, was it a day after or something that had been transferred over, and it was at 6,000 or something views, or it was quite small, and you were being very modest about it.
The day it went live, I was busy with my own clients and I didn't get to look at it until that evening. When I would glance in between clients in my app, it said that there were 24 views. And I thought, okay, well, there's a pandemic, there's a crazy election in the US. This is just going to take a while. So that night, I think it was already over 200,000. I had no idea until I went on and thought, I think the app still says 24 views. So it was a pleasant surprise, and it's only exploded from there.
Fantastic. So we're going to talk about storytelling. So give us an idea about a little bit about your story in terms of how you've kind of got to where ultimately the pinnacle of your life, which is coming on and talking to me.
Yeah, well, there's two places that I really started with storytelling. The first was fun, and then the second was more professional. I was born with 2 different color eyes. And growing up, when you have something like that, that's very unique, which I know everybody's now leaning into trying to see. It's too hard to see with the lighting in my glasses, but I have a brown eye and a green eye. So when you have something different like that, you get a lot of attention. And the most common bit of attention I would get is, do you know your eyes are 2 different colors? And at first it's great. And then after a while, it gets pretty annoying. So I started to tell this story about how I was actually born with brown eyes and ate green crayons and woke up the next day and my eye was green. And that story has followed me for decades, where people will tell me they still remember me when they see crayons and they associate that with me. And I started to realize that, that was a story to entertain and be playful, but you can really connect with people. So as I've moved throughout my career of helping companies with shaping culture and building leaders and creating a work environment where people can thrive, storytelling is such a big piece of that because it's showing you what we encourage and value or what we discourage. And I've used that in roles where I was a global head of culture, where I have 90,000 employees in 150 countries, and you need to connect, and you need, for someone to make any change in culture, you've got to be able to reflect and set intentions on what it means to you. And I found storytelling was such a powerful way to help with that.
So storytelling is important. So give us some examples in terms of what you've been involved in and some of the stories that where you've seen stories transform the way things were going to happen, or
sometimes I use them to give tips to leaders. So I once was working with a team that was really struggling with so much change, and we were coming together to plan the change management for yet another organizational change. And you just looked around the room and everybody, there were bags under everyone's eyes and no one wanted to be there because this is the same conversation they've had over and over and they never get a different outcome. So I started to play with a metaphor and I said, I want you to think about a plate of spaghetti. It's this tangled mess of noodles and you can't really separate them or organize them. If you do manage to get one up, it probably slaps you in the face while you're eating it. And I said, this is what our employees' brains feel like dealing with this change. It's overwhelming and they can't make sense of it. So your job is not to make spaghetti. Your job is to make waffles, to make these row after row of neatly organized squares where you can see one and know the others are there, but you're focusing on one at a time. So I would play with metaphors like that really would help people start to think differently about what they had to do, as opposed to, let's talk about all the different ways we can navigate through change. And I just was amazed that no matter where people were in the world, they were connecting with these and responding. In fact, that story, I had an Italian man stand up in the session and say, like, as much as this pains me, even I will make waffles and not spaghetti. And so to see, playfulness and connection like that is really powerful. I've also done these huge corporate-wide transformation projects where we were presenting it to senior leadership to get approval to go forward. And it didn't, because we hadn't figured out the right story. We went first with data and that didn't work. And then
you said that you worked with the CEO and you said, can I see your slides? And it was basically like a slide pack of like data.
Yes. Yeah, that was a CEO I was working with that was preparing for a presentation and he wanted to use storytelling. And he showed up to the session with me and he had 45 slides of analyst data for a 45-minute presentation. And his whole goal was to help his company think about moving in a new direction and increase their trust in him. And neither of the data slides were going to help get there. So we put all that aside and I helped him realize he had a story that was a great metaphor from something his son had been working on that worked really well.
Tell us the story.
So that one, I have to anonymize it a bit. That's my changing it on the fly because some of that is a little bit confidential. So in this case, the CEO wanted to help the company move into new markets and to take on risk. And most of the people were just successful doing what they were doing. They didn't see the need. And so what we did is use a story from his daughter, who actually was a really gifted athlete, who was wonderful at doing things without even trying. So she was a gymnast and could just do anything without having to put a lot of effort in. And in talking to her, he asked her, are you trying? Are you exerting yourself? Like, what are you doing? And she said, no, why should I? I don't have to. It's great. And it opened up this conversation of, but don't you want to grow and be able to do new things and ultimately try for a scholarship? Like, if you don't try, you're going to get passed by your competitors, but you're also going to get bored. And so he had been relaying this story to me before we started working. And as he brought these slides and he started to talk about where he wanted to take the company, I realized he has this really powerful personal story that's a great metaphor. It's not in the industry. It's nothing that is going to get their heads confused. He can use that to help them understand, oh, this can be completely different. And so in this case, we worked on that story of how she didn't have to try. She wasn't trying to break into new markets. And ultimately, she took on a whole new routine. So gymnastics is really hard. As you go through the floor, the bar, the beam, you learn new difficulty. It is hard stuff. And she was struggling and she couldn't do it. And she was afraid to take risk. And so she realized she had to approach things different to be able to improve. And so we worked on this story for his company, and amazingly, he tells a story and people come up to him after and continue to keep coming up to him saying like they understood. And now is the time to move into new markets and begin to embrace things.
Fantastic. And it's a lovely way of using a story, because ultimately we have belief systems, don't we? Or we're happy doing things. And if we take, if the best example of a belief system is in sports, whereas that people will like certain teams, and it doesn't matter how much or how many facts you may lay on the table that sports team isn't any good, we support them, and therefore it's part of our belief.
I just heard fascinating research that Adam Grant, who's an organizational psychologist, did, right? So he has a book that's just come out. In the book, he talks about this research where he did this based on 2 U.S. baseball teams of the Red Sox, which are in Boston, and the Yankees, which are in New York. And they were trying to see, could we find common ground where this rivalry would have appreciation for each other? And they thought, well, if we just say, like, we both love baseball, so this must be okay. Didn't work. They were like, I don't care. I hate him. He's a Red Sox fan or he's a Yankee fan. What actually worked was taking a Yankee fan and saying, can you imagine if you grew up in Boston and what you would have been exposed to and what games you went to? And they told the story of a child growing up in the opposite city. And that was the turning point for people having appreciation and connection, because they saw the story, it connected to their emotions and what they felt, and then their attitude changed towards the person. And so, people often think storytelling is a soft thing, but neurologically, it is pulling on trust and empathy and all of these things that are creating connection and ultimately impacting how you decide.
And it also, my understanding is it impacts on the limbic brain as well, in terms
Absolutely.
which the limbic brain is being our old brain rather than being the new brain.
The reptilian brain, yeah.
I'm trying to remember what it was called. So what makes a good story? What makes a good story?
There's really 4 questions that you want to be able to answer in a good story. And the first is, what is the context? Like, what's the setting? What's happening? Why do I even care as the listener? The second is, what is the conflict? Where's that moment where something changes or a problem happens and that initial context all of a sudden becomes in jeopardy in some shape or form? And the third is, what is the outcome?
Right.
So if you can anchor a story with those 3 points, as the listener, I'm going to follow it better. The fourth, which is optional, but I always encourage leaders to think about it, is what is the takeaway?
Right.
Because if you have all of that and you start to arc a story out through those pieces, then you can start to broaden it to engage emotions and senses and think about what the right order is to tell it and play with it. But having those 3 pieces are really your anchors and the takeaway of what you want people to get at the end of it.
And if you look at any movie, Pixar movie, anything like that, they all have those elements to it, in terms of there's always an element of conflict.
Yeah, and really Pixar follows this model. They have their own model for storytelling, which is fantastic. They follow a version of the hero's journey, which is Joseph Campbell's brilliant approach for a storytelling arc. It's what the Star Wars films were based on. I actually don't encourage that for leaders because it gets very involved and there's many steps to it. And unfortunately, most people in business will spend 2-3 hours thinking about their PowerPoint pitch, but maybe 5 minutes thinking about what they're going to say. And people abandon stories because if they find an idea for a story, they feel like they can't tell it. And if you have someone trying to work through the hero's journey and they can't really remember where they are and who's the guide on this side, it's too overwhelming. So I think if you can focus on the 3 pieces, you get the structure and it allows for you to play with things as you want.
So in terms of, it's about the context, the conflict, and then what is the outcome?
Yep.
Okay, so what if we're sitting down and if we've got a presentation to do, and because normally the first thing you do is you just put PowerPoint slides together and then go, okay, so how am I going to present this? So what should we be doing?
Don't open PowerPoint. Start first with Post-its or a sheet of paper and start thinking about, who is my audience? Who is the persona in the audience I'm talking to? What do I want to get them to? What do I want them to know, think, feel after this or do different? And where are they at now? Because once you anchor in that, then you can make sure you're putting the right things in the story to help that person have the best understanding. Once you get that, you then, with that persona in mind, start to think through the 3 parts of a story of the context, the conflict and the outcome and the takeaway. Once you get that, then you can start to see, what additional things do I need to back this up? In the case of the CEO that came with 45 slides, he ended up using 2. Because he didn't need all of that other stuff. What he needed to do was connect them to what needed to be different. So I think when you start in PowerPoint, you get so caught on formatting and tinkering around that you lose the focus. But if you start outside of it and you really think about what you're trying to do, you can then weave in what's needed, be able to have the spotlight be on the story and the storyline, and not a whole bunch of slides where someone says, I'm not going to read this to you, and gloss over stuff.
And if we're telling stories, do we need to stand up and better say we've got two and use, I've got two different color eyes, or can we use business stories as well? Is it okay to do that?
You use whatever you are comfortable with.
Right.
When I start with leaders, I have them start thinking about their professional experiences, because that doesn't feel as vulnerable. If everyone has had a first job, a first day, a great project, a worst project, a great leader, a difficult time, when you start creating that list, you realize there's a bunch of stuff. You are always welcome to use a personal story, but it's in the context of what you're trying to do. Like, the biggest mistake people make in storytelling is they tell the story they want to tell and not the story the listener needs to hear. Right. And the difference is it's about your audience and where you want to get them to. And so if you can use your personal story where it's not me, and there's no point to it, but that it's a way, like in this case with the CEO, where we could use his daughter to give this metaphor and parallel story, that's actually going to give you more trust, because you're then viewed as more vulnerable. The listener has more empathy, more oxytocin is released in the brain, and people feel closer and more trusting of you. But it's not a requirement.
Yeah, I remember it would be 6 years ago, basically teaching storytelling to a sales force. And I actually heard recently that they're still using storytelling, which is fantastic. I actually heard a pitch, and the thing is that when you do it, it's actually quite scary, because everyone's
incredibly vulnerable.
Because the vulnerability is the first time you do it, because everybody's expecting you. I'm like I'm holding a clicker. It's like you click, and everyone's expecting the first slide, and they're expecting to be asleep by the fifth one. And if you're actually telling a story, what you find with the audience, even on Zoom, is you get this silence. And of course, because I'm speaking now, like the silence, people go, that's bad. I've got to. There's something wrong. There's something wrong. And then, of course, the internal voice in your head saying, this storytelling thing was a bad thing. Go back to the slides. Go back to the slides.
It's very vulnerable. The problem is, to be a good storyteller, you have to tell a story. So the work I do with leaders is always to get them telling a story immediately, so they can realize there's a response that is really positive. When I was doing that guest speaking at Purdue, I was talking about actually storytelling to them. I always open with a story, and a tip: don't say I have a story or here's a story. Go right into it. Even before I introduce myself, I will go straight into a story because it's an attention grabber, and then I come back around for the other stuff. So I go into a story, and this particular presentation had many stories throughout, and this was a part of their coursework. So they're taking notes, their heads down. They are Gen Z. They are not making eye connection. They are capturing everything in their technology. And every time I would tell a story, they literally stopped and leaned forward and were glued. And it was so fascinating to watch the difference of what their brains were telling them to do and what they picked up on. So it is very vulnerable, whether it's a story in writing, whether it's a verbal story. And when you do it, you start to see the response. That CEO, I had to give him little things to try so he could see the response and realize, oh, I can do this. And there can be a really powerful response from it.
And you do a lot of work with senior leaders and stuff. And I think, so I was on a call this week, and I said to the person, tell me about yourself. What's your story? And I looked up at the clock, and the person was still going 15 minutes later.
Yeah, people are awful at that, aren't they?
And it was like, no, I asked you to tell me your story, not the story of your life. Yeah. I think, and when I asked you, tell me your story, you went in, and there was a very, very clear story. And I think, is this something that you think that leaders and that should have, that people should be ready to tell a story as part of the way that not just I'm standing up in front of people and I need to get something over, but in effect embed storytelling through their life. You know, when someone introduces you, so they say, so give us a little bit about your background. Well, I started life with, I've got 2 different color eyes, and you go into that story.
Yeah. You know, the funny thing is people already are using storytelling throughout their life. They're just not thinking about it when it feels easy, which is when you're with friends and family, or you're sharing an anecdote or reminiscing. Like, that feels easy. And our bodies feel a little bit threatened, like something is different. This is dangerous when we do it for work. And so the thing to remember is you already are a storyteller. So the goal is, let's help you feel more confident by knowing different places where you can find stories and learning a story structure. Having a story about yourself that grounds people in who you are is so helpful, because whenever someone meets you, what they're really thinking is, do I need to know this person?
Yeah.
And if you take 15 minutes to answer that, then I might think, okay, maybe I don't need to know this person.
Yeah.
But the best way to think about stories are that we are processing like 64 gigabytes of information every day in our brains. I think I need to verify that data point, but stories are like a filing cabinet in our brain. It's telling us where to put the different things that we're processing.
Yeah, I'm thinking of getting a button fitted under my desk just here, that when I press the button, my phone rings and I say, oh, sorry, it's a really important call. Can I take it?
Right. The phone a friend escape strategy. We all can know.
Yeah. So rather than Donald Trump's Diet Pepsi button,
right.
My phone's ringing. So I'm sorry, but your 15-minute story about yourself has gone on a little bit too long.
The generation that's doing this so well, though, is Gen Z, because TikTok is the 1 minute, like, tell a story like that. Sometimes there's a part 2.
I'm so jealous.
But they're getting it. And this is another reason to do it, because stories are capturing attention in a much faster way.
Yes. I mean, we try and teach storytelling in terms of building that around your social profile.
Yeah.
And actually it's a lot of people struggle with it because it is a different way of thinking, because we've grown up in terms of thinking about facts, and using facts as a way of, I've been in this job for 15 years. But of course, if you say that, then someone will say, well, I've been doing it for 17 years. So
the thing about storytelling is you can still use facts to bring it to life. And typically when you use story and data, you need far less data than you think. But what the story is going to do is bring new meaning to the data. This particular CEO actually had done the 45 slides he had presented before to the company. Like, what are you trying to do? Just say it louder for the people in the back? What you need is not the same data. You need a reason for people not to look past the data. And that's what a story is going to help you do. It's going to give meaning. There's very good reasons why charities don't tell the story of the hundreds of thousands. They tell the story of the one that is struggling with whatever they support, because then you get that empathy and you can extrapolate that impacts so many others.
Yeah. Karen, that's been fantastic. Really enjoyed the conversation with you, and I had not noticed that you'd got 2 different color eyes. So that's
not the best lighting.
Yeah, so that's. Remind people where they can get hold of you again.
Yep, my website is the best place, KarenEber.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your insights and telling some stories.
Thank you for having me. Good fun.
And congratulations for getting on TEDx and stuff.
Thank you so much.
I mean, it's life-changing, and that's just gifts like that are hard to come by,
Yeah, I feel super fortunate.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.